A dramatic turn in the negotiations, incredible news for Ukrainians about the end of the war. In the joint forces operation, the Russians were outsmarted and a bloody sweep was carried out. They lured them in and destroyed them. Kupiansk simply cut the Russians off. This trap actually worked. A sensation. London is preparing an army for Ukraine, setting a course for a Black Sea war. A two-star officer will lead the coordination. This is the beginning of a big game. Hell in Russia, blackout in Rostov, trains are burning, a coal apocalypse on the railways. A collapse of unprecedented scale has struck the aggressor. Shock. American officials are sounding the alarm. Umerov has already given his support. Kyiv is rewriting the peace formula. Trump has twisted Putin's arm. The shocking plan has already been approved. You haven't heard the truth like this before. All this and more in our upcoming report, Hotspot. At this very moment, a major turn of events is unfolding. American officials emphasize that every point of the peace plan will be coordinated with Kyiv down to the smallest detail, and the White House press secretary stated that Rustem Umerov, the secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, has already supported most of the plan's provisions during negotiations. In addition, Ukraine is rewriting one of the central points of the US peace formula, peace for peace. Ukrainian media, citing the Wall Street Journal, have revealed the first details. The initial draft proposed conducting an audit of all international aid to Ukraine. In the version agreed upon by Kyiv, this point was replaced with a provision granting full amnesty to all parties for actions committed during the war. Therefore, there is a high probability that other points of the deal can also be rewritten. And last night, Zelensky urgently made a statement. We will fight for an adequate end to the war. The Ukrainian side has intensified work on the points of the new peace plan. The president of Ukraine emphasized that calls and meetings with partners are being held constantly and they can change a lot. It has begun. The blackout has reached the Rostov region. Unknown drones cut off power for Russians. And one more piece of good news from Arayev. On the East Siberian Railway, a pink train carrying coal derailed. Yes, once again traffic is paralyzed and the prosecutor's office has taken up the case.
There are no casualties. About 150 meters of railway track have been destroyed. Restoration crews are working at the scene. The expected delay for 6 trains is over 6 hours.
And here is the first detail of the investigation. The track repair workers helped ensure that the coal, which is already in short supply, definitely wouldn't reach Russians. The preliminary cause of the incident is believed to be a foreign object left on the tracks, which workers forgot there during repairs. By the way, a day before this, a freight train caught fire on the border of Perm-Krai. According to reports, the tank cars contained gas condensate. Breaking news! The United Kingdom is preparing troops for Ukraine amid a new round of US negotiations. At the same time, it has become known that coordination between the troops of different countries will be carried out by a group led by a British 2-star officer. There are also plans to expand the Black Sea group of Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria to better protect maritime routes and clear mines from ports. A true triumph for Ukrainian forces. A Ukrainian Barracuda blew up a Russian depot on the banks of the Dnipro. Judging by the powerful detonation, the roasting of the Russians was a resounding success, and immediately afterward, the Russian army lost its stockpile of V ammunition. At this very moment, a bloody purge of Russians is underway. Pokrovsk lured them in, Kupiansk cut them off, and the Ukrainian armed forces delivered a deadly counterstrike. The occupiers are suffering colossal losses. Kupiansk has turned into a meat grinder, and an entire group of Russians was simply trapped in a snare. Watch for sensational details of this brilliant operation.
It played a cruel trick on the occupiers. While the enemy threw all its forces into a desperate attempt to seize control of the ruins of the city destroyed by the Russian army, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a counterattack 200 kilometers to the north, in Kupiansk. The enemy forces there suffered huge losses, according to the Ukrainian command, and were forced to retreat.
The enemy was cleared out from the northwestern outskirts. They're no longer there, and that's a huge achievement.
In fact, the Ukrainian armed forces have cut off the Russian invaders in the northern part of Kupiansk from their main supplies of provisions, cannon fodder, and ammunition. Next, according to Commander Fedorenko, his unit and an adjacent unit set about locating the remaining Russian sabotage groups and clearing them out. As of now, the operation is almost complete.
If you open a map that more or less accurately reflects the line of contact, you'll see that the enemy has been pushed back quite significantly in the northern outskirts. And what does that mean? The farther we manage to push the enemy forces away from the northern outskirts of Kupiansk, the less room and opportunity they have to send their sabotage groups into the city itself.
But unfortunately, the same kind of brilliant successes can't be claimed by the Ukrainian armed forces on another hottest section of the front near Pokrovsk, or in the city itself. Russian assaults there don't stop day or night. It seems the Kremlin has thrown all its forces into taking the city. Nevertheless, despite all their efforts, the Ukrainian command notes that our defenders are heroically holding the line.
The situation in and around Pokrovsk is extremely difficult, but somehow we're still holding on.
According to the military, most of the city is now in the so-called gray zone. This is when control over the territory constantly shifts from one side to the other, and fighting takes place for every building entrance. Syrskyi also fully understands the complexity of the situation in Pokrovsk. In particular, the commander-in-chief stated that the AFU units and other components of the defense forces continue to carry out their tasks in the Pokrovsk-Mir-Novgorod agglomeration area, despite the fact that enemy activity remains high in this sector.
Enemy activity remains high, but clear coordination and the well-coordinated actions of our units help us to resist it. We are working to ensure the continuity of our logistics and are taking measures to disrupt the enemy's supply routes.
Nevertheless, the situation in the Pokrovsk direction remains extremely difficult. The enemy, disregarding their losses, continues to assault AFU positions, the commander-in-chief shares in his operational update.
In just the past 4 days, total enemy losses in the Pokrovsk direction amounted to 487 personnel. Of these, 350 are irrecoverable losses. The exchange fund is being replenished with captured Russian soldiers.
For security reasons, the Ukrainian command does not disclose further details about the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. However, they can share information about completed special operations on the front line. For example, the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kirilo Budanov, gave an interview in which he shared details of one of the most daring airborne operations by the GUR, during which special forces, having secured certain positions behind enemy lines, managed to break through and establish a full-fledged ground corridor. At that time, Budanov himself was nearby and was in command of the operation.
Why was such an operation necessary, and why was it carried out in this particular way? Because the situation was extremely tense and critical. I want to remind you that all of this happened against the backdrop of official statements from the Russian Federation about the capture of the city. When Gerasimov reported to Putin that the city had been taken, and here you need to understand what the situation was like at that moment. Nothing else would have worked. What we did allowed us to win precious time, so that the main units of the armed forces could calmly, or as calmly as possible, approach the city to reinforce it, so to speak.
It is possible that even at this very moment, special units of the GUR are carrying out another special operation in the Pokrovsk direction. Military social media channels are already reporting on the clearing of Pokrovsk, strikes on enemy supply lines, and the establishment of alternative logistics routes. Now for the AFU, so all we can do is wait for official confirmation of the good news from the Ukrainian command.
It happened. Poland is officially in a pre-war mode. Sabotage acts are happening one after another. Enemy drones are in the sky, and there was an explosion near Lublin, which became the last straw. But the main question now is this: is Warsaw ready to give Moscow such a response that the Kremlin will lose any desire to go further? The answer is coming up.
Russia has attacked Poland.
Nowadays, the more commonly used and widely recognized term for this phenomenon is hybrid war. And you could definitely say that it is already well underway because things keep happening in Poland all the time on a regular and ongoing basis. Since
the moment of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, neighboring Poland has also been systematically under threat. And while earlier only politicians and statesmen talked about a possible Russian war against Poland, over time those predictions began to come true. The climax came in September 2025 when about 24 Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace. A significant number of them entered from Belarus. 4 UAVs were shot down. Polish military officials stated that in September, the threat from Russian drones was very real.
so far, the measures that Poland is currently taking in response to the situation are primarily diplomatic in nature rather than being military actions. They have not crossed that particular line yet, but if we're talking about the country's military leadership, they openly state that Russia is preparing for a possible attack on Poland, and Poland is also taking appropriate measures.
It's not just about drones. Recently, there have been several acts of sabotage on the railways in Poland. In particular, a section of track leading to the Polish-Ukrainian border was damaged. The country's Prime Minister Donald Tusk emphasized that these were acts of sabotage. According to him, 2 Ukrainian citizens are suspected of the attacks. They arrived in Poland from Belarus and managed to escape back after the sabotage.
If the Poles had managed to detain them, they would have faced rather lengthy prison sentences. Basically, these are people who were willing to sell themselves to Russia for money.
Polish law enforcement is convinced that the Ukrainians were hired by Russian special services and has already demanded that Belarus extradite the suspects. This chain of events culminated in an attack in Russia's St. Petersburg on the Polish ambassador Krzysztof Krajewski when he arrived in the city to meet with Poles living there.
Poles are perceived as enemies. And to set this gang on the ambassador and note that the police did nothing, they just simply watched and basically smirked, merely observing. This is not just a natural outcome. I am convinced that this attack was fully planned and sanctioned by the relevant authorities, either in St. Petersburg or perhaps even in Moscow.
An aggressive group of Russian activists carried signs with anti-Polish and anti-Ukrainian slogans and attacked the ambassador because his country supports Ukraine. The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that at first there were verbal insults, but then there was a clear attempt to use physical force, which forced the ambassador's security guards to intervene.
Hell in Russia. Ukraine has unleashed a fiery collapse. The latest missiles and drones are burning Russia to dust. Strikes of unprecedented power. Our missiles and drones are breaking through Russian defenses. Which developments are scorching Russia's rear and changing the course of the war? Watch.
Self-propelled artillery, mortars, drones, electronic warfare, shells, ammunition, communication systems, air defense, missiles. Ukraine is actively ramping up the production of its own military equipment and ammunition. Production is becoming increasingly precise, large-scale, and technologically advanced.
During this war, Ukraine has already reached a milestone. Almost 60% of the weapons we have, the weapons our soldiers use, are Ukrainian-made. And these are powerful weapons with many advanced features.
This is no longer just a local industry. Ukraine is building its own military technological shield, a network of production lines, testing grounds, and combat units that turn ideas into weaponry. And our specialists immediately test them in real conditions.
The Ukrainian side is scaling up strike capabilities with a range of over 1,000 kilometers.
Let's start with drones, that small but decisive technology that overnight changed the rules of war. The FP family of strike platforms and other Ukrainian models are produced according to the principle fast, cheap, effective. Their advantages are simple design, rapid production, and tactical relevance. They make it possible to carry out precision strikes, disrupt enemy logistics, and keep enemy positions far from the front line under constant pressure.
In 2024, about 1 million units were contracted, and already in 2020, by 2025, production had increased to 30,000 FPV drones per month. It should be noted that this quantity, an annual production of about 4 million FPV drones, is a record figure, even taking into account the capabilities of the military-industrial complexes of all NATO countries combined. In other words, at this particular moment in time, the Ukrainian Ukroboronprom is producing an unprecedented number of unmanned aerial vehicles. For comparison, the United States Army adds approximately 100,000 unmanned aerial vehicles to its arsenal each year. Once again, I want to emphasize that the Ukrainian defense industry produces up to 4 million drones.
The technological production recipe is simple. A composite fuselage, 3D printed wings, inexpensive components, and open source navigation solutions. All this makes it possible to produce functional platforms in batches. But you can't cut costs on electronics. Navigation and guidance systems make the drones resistant to Russian electronic warfare. Otherwise, mass waves of launches won't break through the enemy's dense defenses. At the same time as drones, a strategic direction is also developing. Here, the key players are missiles and missile systems, which strike at the enemy's rear, depriving them of fuel, depots, and command nodes. Neptune is a domestic anti-ship and coastal missile system that has strengthened the security of maritime borders and given Kyiv tools to impact the enemy's logistics in the Black Sea. Here,
There is something unprecedented in world history. The next case is that Ukraine, as a country that effectively does not possess a navy, inflicted severe damage on the Russian Federation by destroying up to 35% of the Black Sea Fleet's vessels at one point. According to the British side, the naval activity of the Russian Federation in the Black Sea Basin is a consequence of this. The use of both strike drones and accordingly naval drones has dropped to a historic minimum.
Another important milestone is the FPV-5 Flamingo cruise missile. This is a fully Ukrainian development with a stated range of up to 3,000 kilometers.
For comparison, the legendary American Tomahawk has a strike range of 1,600 kilometers. The warhead of the Tomahawk is about 500 kilograms. The warhead of the Flamingo is about 1 ton, 150 kilograms. The most recent documented use of the Flamingo was a strike on the oil terminal in Tuapse. Moreover, Russian public channels themselves confirmed that the Ukrainian side used these types of weapons. In
the combination of small drones and large cruise missiles, Ukraine gains both scale and strategy. Drones keep the enemy on edge, missiles strike critical targets, and together this seriously undermines the enemy's ability to wage a prolonged war. But Ukraine's defense industry is not just about small and large systems, but also time-tested developments like the Bodana, Stogdan, and other artillery and anti-tank systems. These provide mobility, firepower, resilience, and operate within a unified strike network. Drone reconnaissance, artillery adjustment, precision, and missile strikes, and so the cycle repeats.
40% of the Russian budget depends on revenue from the sale of oil and petroleum products. And accordingly, taking into account this budget-forming sector of the occupying country, adjustments are made to the actions of the Ukrainian side, namely the use of strike drones and means of destruction, specifically Flamingo and Neptune, when neutralizing oil refining complexes of the Russian Federation. According to the Russian side's assessment, losses resulting from the Ukrainian strike on the oil refining complex of the Russian Federation are estimated at around $100 billion.
Ukraine's production capabilities are already extending beyond its borders. Through agreements and joint projects, Ukrainian companies are legalizing assembly and serial production in European countries. If before the start of the full-scale war, the Ukrainian defense industry was lagging behind, then by 2024 production volumes reached about $9 billion, and in 2025 they grew to $35 billion. Plans for 2026 include scaling up to $60 billion. And this is only the beginning.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Putin has just been sentenced, Spain has blown up the Kremlin, and weapons of destruction are already on their way to Ukraine. This is a fiery ultimatum, a secret arsenal for the war's finale. Watch for all the details.
Spain plans to allocate a new aid package to Ukraine worth 817 million euros. It is expected to be approved within a month, Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez announced.
We are an ally and a friend of Ukraine, and it is a great honor for us to welcome Zelensky at the Moncloa Palace and, in a broader sense, to express our love for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. When in 2023 Ukraine was in dire need of anti-aircraft missile systems, negotiations were underway. They were deciding who would provide what. The Spanish were the first to give us American-made Hawk air defense systems that had been in storage. And the Hawks, including those from Spain, demonstrated very high effectiveness.
This aid includes 300 million euros as part of the security agreement and 100 million euros under the Pearl instrument for the purchase by NATO countries of weapons for Ukraine from the US, and 215 million euros under the EU SAFE instrument for the procurement of equipment to counter drones as well as radars and other hardware.
The United States is no longer providing aid to Ukraine. The United States is willing to sell weapons to European countries even if they then transfer them to Ukraine. In
the framework of this cooperation, Spain will purchase 40 missiles for the ARST air defense systems, which are in short supply for Ukraine during the winter period.
Spain has traditionally been a good manufacturer of weapons, small arms, and armored vehicles. It's a mistake to write them off. In the context of the fact that the quantitative and to some extent qualitative parameters of the weapons produced by the Spanish have decreased over the past decades, but this is a general European trend.
It was also announced that our country will have comprehensive cooperation with the Spanish in the field of air defense. In Madrid, 5 bilateral documents were signed, including a memorandum of understanding on industrial cooperation in the field of security and defense between Spanish and Ukrainian companies.
The Spanish may not be like that. They're not loud, but they do often offer assistance, especially when asked.
During his visit, President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Spain for its support of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, particularly for the military assistance provided since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Putin's tank graveyard. The Kremlin is drowning in despair. The dictator's tank army is falling apart at the seams, and production has simply vanished. How did the potential of Putin's once mighty armored vehicles collapse? Watch.
We must not only continue to keep pace with the global economy, but strive to outpace its growth by unlocking our own potential.
But in Russia, there is neither growth nor potential. None can be seen. In particular, even the most resilient are now starting to go under. Thus, the Russian military giant Uralvagonzavod, which produces armored vehicles and enjoys all the privileges of the military-industrial complex, can't cope and is falling apart at the seams.
So what is the plant's management doing? Well, they don't formally fire people, but they switch them to a 4-day work week, which means a 20% pay cut. Or a 3-day work week, which means a 40% pay cut. This is exactly the situation that's happening, but even that is no longer helping. And that stage has already passed. According to the latest statistics, about 250,000 people in Russia have been working like this recently.
And now reducing shifts to a minimum no longer works. Layoffs are looming at the enterprise that is the flagship of Russian tank manufacturing. This was reported by the Russian publication E1. In some departments, up to 50% of the staff is planned to be laid off, and across the entire enterprise, 1 in 10 employees will lose their job.
Previously, it was kind of like this. Civilian production might not have been very profitable, but there was a lot of money for military production, and that somehow made up for it. But now it seems that even spending on military production is being cut, and it looks like Ralvagen can no longer cover losses with profits from military contracts. It can't offset the losses in the civilian sector, so now the cuts will affect the civilian side. The company is laying off people, reportedly about 10%.
Experts explain that the reason for all this is the dramatic decline of the Russian economy. Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries, which are depriving Russia of millions in petrodollars, Western sanctions, and increased pressure from the US on the Russian oil industry, have already led to a situation where even the negative forecasts for the economy are too optimistic. It will get even worse.
Their negative forecast from the central bank, let me remind you, is a 2.5 to 3.5% drop in GDP, 12% inflation, and a 20% interest rate. In other words, they will have to raise the rate back up to 20% next year. And that's their negative scenario, which I don't even consider negative. It's just the current reality. That's the point. The thing is, the accumulated problems, they just keep coming up every day and prevent the central bank from maintaining the scenario they consider manageable.
The situation has escalated to the point where the economic decline in Russia has to be publicly acknowledged.
Question: is that enough? Is this what we wanted?
In fact, even according to official data, the recession has already affected 19 out of 24 sectors of the Russian economy. Moreover, they're even starting to have problems with defense industry enterprises. If these enterprises are already experiencing non-payments, not getting paid from the budget, and the work week is being reduced, for example, Uralvagonzavod, this means their funding has been cut. But this actually happened about 3 months ago, so these processes are really underway.
At the same time, the funniest thing is that in Russia, they've already figured out how to present this information to the higher-ups. It's all in the spirit of negative growth and unsuccessful successes. So now they openly talk about the economic decline, while adding that there was such an unprecedented boom before that it simply couldn't last forever. And now we're seeing a downturn.
That's their strategy.
to say, no, there's no recession, no economic decline, and then release a statement that, yes, most likely in the fourth quarter there will be an economic downturn, and accompany all of this with a bunch of disclaimers.
The obvious solution, once again, is to revise the budget plan, naturally in the direction of negative growth.
We are holding a whole series of meetings on the framework of the country's main financial document. It is its main priority and primary focus.
And as before, the priority remains the war. So they advise not to expect any improvements in analytics. And if the cuts have already affected the industrial giants of the military-industrial complex, then all enterprises in the country, including private ones, are next in line.
Trump's secret document. Russia will shell out billions. Shock for Ukraine. The plan has already been approved. What other conditions has Washington put forward? Why does the plan that could stop the war provoke anger in Brussels? Urgently, all the secret details of the deal that will shake the world. Watch. A plan without Ukraine, negotiations without Congress.
Ukraine is already being discussed, sold, resold, and sold again.
The Donald Trump administration has given the green light to a peace plan consisting of 28 points, a document that was secretly developed over the past few weeks with representatives of the Russian Federation, but without Ukraine's participation.
The visitor made it clear that it is time to stop the killing and reach an agreement to end the war. Trump believes there is a chance to end this senseless war if flexibility is shown, a White House representative stated.
The chief architect of the plan was Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who, together with Russian negotiator Kirill Pavlovich, met with Dmitriev in Miami to discuss the parameters of the future agreement. Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Mark Rubio, and the president's son-in-law Jared Kushner also participated in the development.
Vance is focused on providing both sides with security guarantees to ensure lasting peace. It includes what Ukraine wants and what it needs for lasting peace, says one of the American officials.
The document itself is still being kept secret, but some of its details have become known to sources. So the 28 points are divided into 4 key sections: peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security for Europe, and the future relations of the US with Russia and Ukraine. And although the White House assures that the plan contains what Ukraine wants and what it needs for lasting peace, the details of the project are raising more and more questions.
All their efforts have reached a dead end. And now they are apparently trying to break through on different fronts.
According to Western media, the plan envisions handing over territories in eastern Ukraine to Russia. First and foremost, parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions that are currently under Kyiv's control. In fact, this is an alignment with Russia's demands regarding Donbass, even though it would have taken Moscow years to seize these territories by military means. Currently, Ukraine controls about 15% of the region. According to Trump's version, these zones should become demilitarized, formally under Russian control, but without the deployment of troops. At the same time, the terrorist state is supposedly going to pay rent for administering Donbass. Ukraine does not formally change its borders, but in reality allows Moscow to administer the territory for money. For the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, the plan proposes freezing the front lines at their current positions. The details have not yet been disclosed. The plan also restricts the Ukrainian army, reduction in troop numbers, a ban on foreign missions, and restrictions on weapon systems, including long-range strike capabilities. The document mentions the winding down of American military aid and a ban on the deployment of Western troops on Ukrainian territory after the war ends. In effect, this is a rejection of joining NATO, which Moscow has been pushing for since 2014. In return, Russia promises not to attack Ukraine or other European countries and to formalize this commitment in law.
It seems to me that the administration believes that something has changed. This is that Zelensky is currently facing problems and Zelensky is politically weakened from the White House's perspective, and perhaps that's why Trump is staying silent and not commenting on this in any way so as not to draw more support to Zelensky by criticizing him. I understand that not all criticism will help Zelensky's popularity, but in general, we see that the president is silent and we can simply look for different reasons. But from the administration's point of view, they see that there is a scandal in Ukraine. They see that the president of Ukraine might now agree to a deal that he previously would not have accepted. How much this reflects reality, we do not know. But we also see ongoing efforts by Vitkov and Dmitriev, who are trying to merge in their amorous ecstasy and start making money. And this is the main thing that this administration wants. And for people to simply ignore Ukraine, that's what Russia wants, while Ukraine continues to be a thorn in their side.
In addition, Trump's peace plan includes a provision recognizing the Russian language and non-guarantees for the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, whose position the Kremlin has been promoting for decades.
This is preparation for Ukraine to be absorbed by the Russian Empire.
Across the ocean, the reaction is mixed. Some senators and congressmen learned about the project from the press. Lindsey Graham emphasized, any peace is only possible with firm security guarantees for Ukraine. Don Bacon compared Trump's actions to Munich in 1938, warning that trying to appease an aggressor without involving the victim only accelerates new threats. In the US and Europe, it is believed that the plan could be adjusted after consultations with Kyiv, but skeptics are convinced. The proposed framework radically shifts the balance of power, increases pressure from Russia, and weakens Ukraine's position. At the same time, the Trump administration insists that the goal of the document is to end the war and achieve long-term peace by using flexibility and negotiation mechanisms instead of military escalation. That's all for now. For more breaking news from the front, tune in to our next episode.